Winter arrived early in Leningrad in 1941. By September, the roads leading into the city had already begun to close under the pressure of advancing German forces. Within weeks, nearly 3 million people were trapped inside a tightening ring of artillery, barbed wire, and hunger. Food warehouses were burning, railways were cut, and supply lines were collapsing. What followed would become one of the longest and most devastating sieges in modern history. For 872 days, the city endured isolation, starvation, relentless bombardment, and an unforgiving winter that tested the limits of human survival. The story of the siege began months earlier, in June 1941, when Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. German strategy envisioned a swift campaign that would dismantle Soviet resistance before winter. Army Group North advanced rapidly across the Baltic states toward Leningrad, a city that held enormous strategic and symbolic importance. Founded by Peter the Great in 1703, Leningrad was not only a major industrial center but also the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. Capturing it would deal a psychological blow to Soviet morale while eliminating a critical base of military production. By late summer, German forces had pushed through Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Finnish troops advanced from the north, reclaiming territory lost during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940. Between them, the two armies gradually closed the approaches to Leningrad. Soviet commanders attempted to organize defensive lines, but the speed of the German advance and the confusion of the early months of the war left little time for preparation. On September 8, 1941, the final land connection to the city was severed when German forces captured the town of Schlüsselburg on the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. From that moment forward, Leningrad was effectively surrounded. Rather than storming the city directly, German command adopted a strategy of encirclement. The intention was to isolate the population and allow starvation and bombardment to force surrender. Inside the city, the reality of the situation became clear quickly. Warehouses containing much of the city's grain supply had been destroyed during early air raids. Rationing was introduced immediately, but the quantities were already dangerously low. Workers in heavy industry initially received the largest rations, followed by soldiers and essential personnel. Children and the elderly received the smallest allocations. As autumn turned to winter, the ration levels dropped further. By November 1941, the daily bread ration for many civilians had fallen to 125 grams. Even this bread often contained substitutes such as sawdust, cellulose, or ground husks to stretch limited flour supplies. Long lines formed outside bakeries and ration distribution points. Many residents spent hours waiting in freezing temperatures for food that barely sustained life. The winter of 1941 to 1942 was among the coldest in decades. Temperatures frequently fell below -20 degrees Celsius. With fuel supplies exhausted and electricity unreliable, homes and public buildings grew dangerously cold. Public transport stopped operating. Water pipes froze. Residents collected water by breaking holes in frozen canals and carrying buckets across icy streets. Despite these conditions, industrial production inside the city continued. Factories shifted to wartime output, producing artillery shells, tanks, and ammunition. Workers often labored through exhaustion and malnutrition, driven by the belief that the city's survival depended on their efforts. The greatest immediate threat, however, remained hunger. By December 1941, deaths from starvation and related illnesses had begun to rise sharply. Hospitals filled with patients suffering from extreme malnutrition. Many were too weak to walk long distances in search of food or fuel. In response to the blockade, Soviet authorities began organizing a supply route across Lake Ladoga. During the warmer months, small vessels attempted to transport food and supplies across the lake under the constant threat of German air attacks. But it was during the winter, when the lake froze solid, that the most critical route emerged. This frozen pathway became known as the Road of Life. Trucks began crossing the ice, carrying flour, grain, and other essential supplies into the city while evacuating civilians, particularly children, to safer regions east of the lake. The route was dangerous. Ice conditions could shift without warning, and German aircraft frequently targeted the convoys. Nevertheless, the road remained the city's lifeline. Throughout the winter of 1941 to 1942, thousands of vehicles traveled the frozen lake. The supplies they delivered were not sufficient to fully relieve the city's hunger, but they prevented total collapse. By early 1942, ration levels gradually improved, though food remained scarce. Life in the besieged city demanded constant adaptation. Residents dismantled wooden fences, furniture, and abandoned structures for firewood. Public gardens and open spaces were converted into small agricultural plots where vegetables could be grown during the summer months. Scientific institutes preserved seed collections with extraordinary care, even as their own staff endured hunger. Cultural life also persisted in unexpected ways. In August 1942, Leningrad's surviving musicians performed Dmitri Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony inside the city. The symphony had been composed during the early months of the siege and had become a symbol of resistance. The performance was broadcast across loudspeakers throughout Leningrad and, according to contemporary accounts, could also be heard by German forces positioned outside the city. Meanwhile, artillery bombardments continued intermittently. German and Finnish positions remained close enough to strike key infrastructure and residential districts. Air raids damaged factories, hospitals, and historic buildings. Yet the city never lost its defensive posture. Soviet troops maintained defensive lines along the outskirts, preventing any direct ground assault. By 1942 and early 1943, the broader course of the war began to shift. Soviet victories in other regions, particularly after the Battle of Stalingrad, allowed the Red Army to redirect resources toward breaking the blockade. In January 1943, Soviet forces launched Operation Iskra, a coordinated offensive designed to open a land corridor along the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. After several days of intense fighting, Soviet troops succeeded in pushing German forces back just enough to create a narrow passage connecting the city to the rest of Soviet territory. Though still vulnerable to artillery fire, this corridor allowed for the construction of a railway line and pipeline that improved the flow of supplies. Conditions inside Leningrad gradually stabilized during 1943. Food deliveries increased, and ration levels improved. Electricity and heating systems began to function more reliably. However, the siege itself had not yet ended. German artillery remained within range, and the city continued to experience bombardment. It was not until January 1944 that Soviet forces launched a large-scale offensive aimed at fully lifting the blockade. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions pushed German troops steadily westward. By late January, the encirclement was finally broken, ending 872 days of siege. The human cost of the blockade was immense. Estimates vary, but historians generally conclude that more than 1 million civilians died during the siege, most from starvation, disease, and exposure. Hundreds of thousands more were evacuated across Lake Ladoga during the war. Entire families disappeared, and many neighborhoods were left largely empty. Despite these losses, the city never surrendered. Throughout the siege, Leningrad remained under Soviet control, its defenses holding despite conditions that might have forced collapse elsewhere. The endurance of its population became one of the most powerful symbols of Soviet resilience during the Second World War. After the war, the memory of the siege became deeply embedded in the city's identity. Monuments, memorial cemeteries, and museums were established to honor those who died and those who survived. The Piskaryovskoy Memorial Cemetery, where hundreds of thousands of victims are buried in mass graves, stands as one of the most solemn reminders of the blockade's scale. Today, the Siege of Leningrad is studied not only as a military event but also as a profound example of civilian endurance under extreme conditions. It revealed the vulnerability of cities during total war, where supply lines, infrastructure, and civilian populations became central targets of military strategy. The siege also highlighted the importance of logistics and geography. Lake Ladoga, which at first seemed only a barrier, ultimately became the route that sustained the city's survival. The narrow corridor opened in 1943 demonstrated how even small strategic gains could alter the fate of millions. Yet the most enduring aspect of the siege lies in the daily choices made by ordinary residents. Teachers continued lessons in freezing classrooms. Engineers repaired power lines under artillery fire. Medical workers treated patients despite shortages of equipment and medicine. Families shared the little food they had while waiting for relief that sometimes arrived too late. For nearly 2.5 years, Leningrad existed in a state of suspended normality, where the routines of city life continued alongside the constant presence of hunger and war. When the blockade was finally lifted in January 1944, the city that emerged had been transformed by loss, but it had also demonstrated a remarkable capacity to endure. The siege of Leningrad remains one of the longest and most devastating urban blockades in recorded history. It stands as a reminder of the human consequences of total war and the resilience of communities under extraordinary pressure. Even decades later, the memory of those 872 days continues to shape how the events of the Second World War are understood.